In today's world, people feel lost in a sea of ideas. Which ones should we accept? Stay tuned because you're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. Here is your host, Kurt Jaros.
Well, a good day to you, and thanks for joining us here on another episode of Veracity Hill, where we are striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. A lot to speak with you about today on our program as we continue our Explore God series. This week we are talking about, is the Bible reliable? And before we get to that, there are a few issues of society in which I want to speak and have addressed on our program. First, what caught my attention this week was the number of tax refunds or the number of complaints about tax refunds that people were getting. They were many people were disappointed that it wasn't as much as in past years. And I wanted to help us think through what this means exactly. Sometimes when we're so narrowed in on one thing, we forget the big picture. And that's often the case with how we read the Bible. If we're so narrowed in on one verse here or there, we forget the big picture. We're not going to understand what that verse is actually saying, what it really means. So how does that principle of interpretation apply to tax returns? Well, if you first you need to ask yourself, how much did the person pay in taxes? That's the big picture. How much did you pay to Uncle Sam, to the federal government, and then how much did you get back? Well, if you got back a small amount, that might not be a big issue if you didn't pay that much or as much to the government. So I think we need to look at the big picture here and realize, hey, maybe that's the case, and very likely I think that is what's happening here, that people are paying fewer taxes, so they are going to get a smaller refund, and that's generally a good thing. Now, if only the government would also, say, cut spending and decrease the debt. Those are other big issues as part of the big picture that people need to be worried about. So if you're on social media or if you're talking to people and they're complaining about their smaller tax refund, maybe first ask them, well, how much did you pay? And how does that compare to last year? So gaining some right perspective is important. Okay. Now I want to introduce someone who has been on the podcast before, but never in person. He's here in studio in West Chicago. His name is Mark Lester, and you might remember him from his Checkmark movie review website. Mark's come on our program from time to time, and we're in that season of the Oscar nominations. And so, Mark, I figured I'd let you take it away with your predictions of the who's going to win the categories, and maybe you can tell us who's nominated for these positions as well.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon. Sorry, afternoon, everyone. Yeah, there are. I won't go through all of them, but there are a lot of factors going into a lot of these, especially with the big one with Best Picture, with a lot of controversies over some of them. So the nominees, for those who don't know, are Black Panther, Black Klansman, Bohemian Rhapsody, The Favorite, Green Book, Roma, A Star is Born, and Vice. And of all these movies, I'm still tossing and turning in my head as to which one I think will win. My personal favorite out of all of them is Roma. If you have Netflix, totally check it out. But I think it's between that and Green Book, because Green Book is a very good feeling movie that, you go to it. If you don't see many movies during the year, it's one that you're like, I really like this one. That was good. It felt good.
What's that movie about, Mark?
Green Book was the one that starred Viggo Mortensen and Mahershala Ali. It was based off the true story of this Italian-American bouncer who takes a African-American musician and basically accompanies him through concerts in the Deep South during the early 1960s. And it's got very good performances, and obviously it deals on racism and, nice character development and very good performances. Mm-hmm. But there was a lot of controversy in that they weren't sure if it was entirely accurate, and then there were, of course, other weird, sometimes political statements made by the director, Peter Farrelly. So that could hurt its chances. It's also up for Best Actor for Mortensen and Supporting Actor for Ali. I think right now my gut reaction is saying it could be Roma, but again, Green Book could make a comeback at it, and that same could even there are even some people saying the same for Black Panther, which would be historic in being the first superhero movie to ever win a Best Picture awards, the first to ever be nominated.
And you mentioned that there was some controversy, and I think some of it's been surrounding Black Panther's nomination.
There was some of it, because I still personally don't understand the entire nomination process for Best Picture, because as even the voting for it, because it's the one category you vote for differently, versus other categories where you just see the 5 or however many nominees and you just say that one and that's it, versus Best Picture where you take all the nominees and you rank them, basically, and they count the ranking somehow. So a movie that gets isn't even everyone's favorite pick could still end up being the Best Picture winner. So it's really interesting and odd in that aspect as well. I think there's also controversy, of course. Probably the most controversial one would be Bohemian Rhapsody, which, for those who don't know, is based off of the story of Freddie Mercury and Queen and stuff. And the main controversy surrounding that is its director, or almost lack thereof director, of Bryan Singer, who was sometimes on set, sometimes wasn't, and then was just hit hard with all these sexual misconduct allegations, and they basically the producers and everyone involved just basically tried to distance themselves, understandably, as far away from him as possible. That movie also brings up for Best Actor, which is a very tough race, because it's nominated for Rami Malek, who I thought did a great job, and he's easily the best part of the movie, but I'm not sure he's going to win Best Actor. It's really close between him and Christian Bale for Vice, and despite your political views and whatnot on Vice, it's really hard to argue that Christian Bale is one of the best actors we have, and he does an outstanding job. So I'm really tossing and turning, but I'm thinking at the moment it would be Rami Malek.
Okay.
There are other awards that I think are very easy to predict. Best Actress, you do have some nominees that might possibly pull an upset, but this is going to be Glenn Close for The Wife.
Okay.
I mean, you might make an argument that Lady Gaga could pull off an upset for A Star is Born, who was really outstanding, but I think they're going to reward her with Best Song, which I think is the easiest one to predict of the whole night.
Sure.
For her song Shallow. Best Supporting Actor is more than likely going to go to Mahershala Ali, again for Green Book, and Supporting Actress would again, also kind of easy to predict, not entirely, but Regina King for If Beale Street Could Talk. And also, it makes me happy, too, because Animated Feature has one of my favorite movies of last year, which I'm happy to say I think has a great shot of winning, and that was Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, which I thought was outstanding, and had anyone who... it's a movie for people who are like, oh, I don't like superhero movies, or I don't like animated movies. So it's a 2-in-1 thing, because it's so wonderful, so funny. It has the best ending credit scene I've ever seen in any superhero movie, and I think it's got a great shot of winning.
Nice. How about for a last pick, give us what you think is going to be the biggest underdog.
The biggest underdog, I think, of all of them, at least of all the Best Picture ones, I think the underdog one in categories, I'm thinking Black Panther still. It all depends, because the voters in the Academy they're changing their membership. They've changed it over the years to include more people, to avoid another year where they're like, oh, Oscar's so white and stuff like that. So that could be a possible Best Picture spoiler, but at the same time, so that would be my underdog pick. But again, I'm still not entirely seeing that being a likelihood.
Yeah. Okay, well, hey, thank you for giving us an update on the movie fronts there. And for those that are interested, Mark is actually going to begin writing movie reviews over at apologetics315.com. We're looking forward to migrating some of his old content over there and the new material that he has. It's a great way for folks that are interested in getting a quick summary of a plot, and then also some critical thoughts, both just from a cinematic front, but also a theological front as well, how we as Christians should understand film as art. Mark, of course, is of like-mindedness with me that art shouldn't be preachy, right? Sometimes Christian art, whatever that is, whatever that might be, it's often done very poorly, and it preaches, and it's not art. Whereas, to me, I think a band, like looking at it from a music front, a band like U2, I mean, they've impacted the culture in ways that, even DC Talk could never have dreamed of. So it's just playing to certain audiences, but I think we should just make objectively beautiful art. And when we do so, I think that will lead people to the transcendent God. So I look forward to the reviews that are forthcoming on Apologetics 315, Mark.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks for coming on our program today.
Thank you.
All right. Well, we are we are going to begin talking about the reliability of the Bible. And again, this is part of our Explore God series, where we are asking the deep questions of life. And to help us work through issues of reliability of the Bible, I've invited Ted Wright. He is the founder of Epic Archaeology. He's a freelance teacher, writer, researcher, and for over a decade, maybe 2 decades now, Ted, you have been a seminary professor, a Christian apologist, an archaeologist. You've been on the History Channel, I think maybe CNN as well, and so most of all, I consider you a friend. So thank you for joining us on the program today, Ted.
It's great to be on, Kurt. Thanks for having me on again.
Yes. Now, I'm sure we are going to talk about archaeology, but some of the issues of reliability go beyond even archaeological matters. But first, let me just start it off this. So I've asked you to come on the program today to talk about the reliability of the Bible. And you have spent some time, again, as a seminary professor, an apologist, and an archaeologist. So why do you think that the reliability of the Bible is important?
Yeah, Kurt, that question sort of gets right to the heart of the matter. And, it's very... We live in such an age in which, you can't trust the news and that kind of thing. So if you think about it, what we're saying as Christians is we're saying that we actually believe that Jesus, this guy that lived 2,000 years ago, that he literally rose from the dead. I mean, that's a pretty, we all believe that's familiar to Christians, but you got to think of how that might sound to someone who is not a believer or who's not as familiar with that. I mean, we're literally saying that not only did he rise again, but he's literally God in the flesh. He's God come down. So this kind of gets to what the Apostle Paul is talking about in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, where he's talking about the fact that if he's basically saying if there is no resurrection, then our faith is futile. So the resurrection is the core miracle. It's the core truth of the Christian faith. And if it didn't happen, if it actually did not happen in history, then we're just all believing a bunch of fairy tales and lies. So then that means that reliability of the text becomes of really great importance because the four Gospels and, of course, the New Testament is really the primary place. Now, today we're talking about this, but there are other places that record contemporary accounts that record some of the same things, but I would consider the New Testament as primary source material for the fact that Jesus rose from the dead. So that's why it's important. Reliability is important because it really anchors the core truth of the Christian faith, and that is that Jesus. What we're saying is that we believe Jesus literally rose from the dead. So that's to answer your question.
Yeah. So there is this connection between the reliability of the Bible and Christian belief, and I was once again attuned to this from a recent tweet from Randall Rouser. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, Christian apologist. He calls himself a tentative apologist here on Twitter. And he puts out this survey, and there have been surveys done on this question before. He writes, if the bones of Jesus were definitively identified in an archaeological dig, would you cease to be a Christian? And the majority of people say yes, which I think is the right answer, actually. I think 1 Corinthians 15 tells us that if Jesus has not been resurrected, if he's still dead, then our faith's in vain, and we call God a liar, Paul says. So yes, we'd be done being Christian. Now, maybe we'd become Jewish, but in terms of Christian theism, there is that connection between the reliability of the Bible and Christian belief. So different apologists approach defending Christianity, the Bible, and the resurrection in different ways. But you take what's called a classical apologetic approach. Can you explain what that approach is?
Yes, absolutely. So the classical approach, again, as you know, we're good friends with Mike Licona and other apologists, and there are apologists who focus primarily on the historical parts, and that's what we do as well at Epic Archaeology. But I try to make the point that C.S. Lewis does. In fact, in one of his most famous books, besides Mere Christianity, is his book called Miracles. And essentially what Lewis is saying is that historical investigation really can't give you, by itself, can't give you the resurrection. So in the classical approach, what we do is we present theistic arguments first, and I'm not going to do that here. There's a lot of good arguments that God exists, but we begin with the premise, or we begin to make the foundational claim that there is a theistic, transcendent, spaceless, timeless, immaterial being called God. So theism comes first. And with theism, then you get miracles. And why are miracles important? Well, because, as we said earlier, the core truth of the Christian faith is the resurrection of Christ from the dead. So, as Lewis said in his book Miracles, he says, but if we admit God, must we admit miracles? Lewis said, indeed, you have no security against it. That's the bargain. He also says this is very, very enlightening, or very interesting thing. And if it's okay if I read a couple of paragraphs, and I won't
sure, yeah.
Long, but it's a very, very insightful thing that Lewis, I don't see a lot of apologists quote this, but I think Lewis is absolutely right about this. He says, if immediate experience cannot prove or disprove the miraculous, still less can history do so. Many people think one can decide whether a miracle occurred in the past by examining the evidence, quote, according to the ordinary rules of historical inquiry, end quote. But the ordinary rules cannot be worked out until we have decided whether miracles are possible, and if so, how probable they are. For if they are impossible, then no amount of historical evidence will convince us. If they are possible but immensely improbable, then only mathematical demonstration, demonstrative evidence will convince us. And since history never provides that degree of evidence for any event, history can never convince us that a miracle occurred. If, on the other hand, miracles are not intrinsically improbable, then the existing evidence will be sufficient to convince us that quite a number of miracles have occurred. The result of our historical inquiries, thus, depends on the philosophical views which we have been holding before we even begin to look at the evidence. The philosophical question must therefore come first. And I think he's absolutely right. So what he's saying is that you can spend all the time you want arguing for the historical reliability of the Bible, but if there is no God, and if God doesn't exist, then the thing that the Bible is recording can't be true. Logically, it can't be true. And I think from a logical standpoint, Lewis is right. So I like to preface a discussion about historical reliability by being careful to make this distinction that so what we're doing is this is another argument for another time, and your listeners and and other people who do a lot of reading. There's some great books out there from William Lane Craig and from John Lennox, and you've had other guests on your show on Veracity Hill, that have some really great arguments for God's existence, intelligent design, any number of arguments. So that's foundational. And it's only after that point then that we begin to look at miracles. And let me just say a couple of quick things about miracles as we kind of get into this a little bit. And it's actually, well, first I want to give you a quote that's sort of, why do we spend so much time, or why does the classical approach spend so much time arguing for theism? Well, because it's foundational. And a very interesting admission in 1997, Richard Lewontin is a scientist who he made this admission in the New York Review of Books in January in 1997. He says this, listen, he said, "It's not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door." That's from Richard Lewontin. So he's admitting that there's a philosophical bias against miracles. This is true not only for scientists, but also for archaeologists as well. So when an archaeologist or a historian like Bart Ehrman, as they're looking into the text, if they're an atheist or if they're an agnostic, then any kind of historical investigation they do is going to be colored with their predisposition to this philosophical bias against miracles. So I think from an apologetic standpoint, it's really important. The classical approach, I think, from a logical standpoint, makes more sense to me. But again, I've got friends who have different views, so I'm not, absolutely dogmatic about it. It's just a view that I take. And then the second thing I want to say about miracles is kind of what is the function of a miracle in the Bible. And you could spend a lot of time on this, but we're not. And that is that, obviously, what's the whole point of miracles? I mean, are we going around saying that, miracles happen every day? No. I mean, that's the whole thing about David Hume's critique about miracles. But in the Bible, miracles confirm the message of a prophet. And, when you look at the Old Testament, and you look at Moses, you look at Elijah, and you look at other prophets, from a biblical standpoint, the miracles confirm the person that's speaking. And, of course, Jesus is a prophet, and more than a prophet, and he will obviously confirm who he is by the miracle of the resurrection. So that's sort of a little background preface to get us started in talking about the historical reliability of the Bible. So all that comes first, and then we get to the historical reliability part. Yeah, and it seems important to sort of lay that good foundation, because a lot of people will immediately dismiss the Bible on the grounds that there are miracle claims, and we know miracles don't happen. So it's good to say, hey, look, let's consider our philosophical assumptions that we have, and if miracles are even possible, then let's take a look at the Bible and let's see what it has to say. Absolutely. And my thought is, well, if the Creator God makes this universe, having him do little miracles here and there is a piece of cake. It's just cakewalk for him. A resurrection is nothing, because Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. I mean, we're here. I mean, the space-time universe is in existence. So we're living in a miracle, as we say. Right. So now the resurrection is the crux here for Christian belief. And so it's one of the most important and first places where we learn about the resurrection. That's the New Testament. And so this really highlights the importance that we place to the credence we give to the New Testament. If the New Testament itself is hogwash, why would we believe in the resurrection? Do I have that right? That's right. That's exactly right. Because the New Testament is the place where we learn about it. So it becomes it's sort of like the important link in the chain. And I like the way our friend Jim Wallace, cold case homicide detective, Jim talks about a chain of custody. Now he's a detective, and I'm an archaeologist, and so there's a lot of crossover and similarity between the two disciplines of being a homicide detective and being an archaeologist. So because you're looking at evidence, and you're looking at trying to find out who did it.
Right. Who did it? And then in your case, once something's discovered from archaeology, you want to make sure it doesn't get into bad hands, that it's manipulated or damaged. So you need that chain of custody so that we can have that secure knowledge of the artifact.
That's right. And in the case of the Bible, and one of the things, Kurt, that when I taught seminary classes, one of the things that I would teach my students is, the first thing we'll talk about is this, because we're talking about the resurrection and the fact that Jesus rose from the dead, and that was an event that happened 2,000 years ago. So it is an event in history, but most people don't think about how do we know the past. So what I like to begin with is a discussion and a question for people listening, and my students, I would ask them the same question, and that is, I would ask them, well, how do we know the past? How do we know once an event happens? Then how do we know it? And he's like, well, I never thought about that before. And so we will get into a discussion about what historians call primary sources. And there are three. Now, I've simplified them. There may be others, but they usually roughly fall into three categories. And the three categories are, number one, eyewitnesses. Number two, historical records or text, manuscripts. And the third is archaeological remains. So we've got eyewitnesses, historical records, and archaeological remains. And just a quick example of how that works, just to kind of show you the three working together. And in a modern example would be like the sinking of the Titanic, which happened in 1912, I believe it was April of 1912, if my memory serves me correctly. And so I don't think anybody today, there are no eyewitnesses alive today who, I think the last eyewitness passed away several years ago. But so nobody today doubts that the Titanic sank. I mean, nobody doubts that. But so the question is, how do we know it? Well, we did have eyewitnesses, people who were there, people who did survive the sinking of the ship. They wrote diaries. They were in paper articles and things like that. So they survived. They wrote these things down. So the eyewitnesses survived. They were there. They were actually present at the sinking of the Titanic. So you can't get any closer to the event than actually having been there. They wrote about it. And the third thing we've got is we actually have the ship. In 1987, the ship was discovered on the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. So we have eyewitnesses, historical records, and archaeological remains. So one little angle on that kind of will really help us to understand the New Testament, and that is, well, what do you do when the eyewitnesses are gone? I mean, what do you do when you have an eyewitness you have two eyewitnesses and they're both they're showing conflicting evidence? Well, in the case of the Titanic in 1912, the people who talked about the sinking of the ship, there were a group that said the ship just sank, and there was another group that said the ship broke in half when it went down on the ocean floor. And there was one eyewitness, and she was a 7-year-old girl, and you can actually look her up on YouTube, and I forget her name, but anyway, she said that she saw the ship break in half. So you've got one person that says this, the other person says that. Well, the only way you can know is to actually go to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean and find the ship. And sure enough, in 1987, when Robert Ballard discovered the ship, the Titanic, he discovered that the ship had actually broken in half, thus confirming the eyewitness account of the person who says the ship broke in half. But here's an observation about that. So the observation is that they were both right about the sinking of the ship. They both were in agreement about the main core
that the ship sank.
Yes, that the ship sank. Now, and that's what you're going to see with eyewitness accounts. You will see little differences here and there, but you will see that they agree on the core truth, and that's similar to what we see with the New Testament as well.
And that's a great point you've made, that some people will approach the Gospels and say that there are differences. There are differences in what happened. And as a result of those differences, they will just dismiss altogether. But that would be akin to the person dismissing the fact that the Titanic sank on the basis that there's conflicting eyewitness testimony.
Exactly.
But as you said, both eyewitness testimonies agree the Titanic sank. So what can we learn about Jesus? And until further evidence comes to light about maybe certain differences in the Gospels, we should hold those differences maybe more with an open hand.
Yes.
In the same way that people approach the Titanic until they can go and see whether it broke into two.
Right. So that's exactly right, Kurt. And one other thing that I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, and that is that with the New Testament now, that's a modern example of the Titanic. That was 1912. That was the 20th century. But when you're talking about the Bible, you're talking about 2,000 years ago, this event. So the only thing that we have left for our knowledge of the past are the eyewitness accounts as they are placed in the historical text. Now, and that's the big $64,000 question: is, are the New Testament documents eyewitness accounts? So we've got two areas in which we can investigate. We have the historical record, and we also have the archaeological remains. And you can compare and contrast what the text says with what we actually find in the ground, and what you can see is pretty remarkable stuff. So with the New Testament eyewitnesses, there's a couple of ways. I mean, there's a whole discussion just about eyewitnesses, but let me just mention two right here, just as we're kind of touching on this today. And that is, with eyewitnesses, what you want ideally as a historian, you want what's called early attestation. Preferably, you want an eyewitness who was at the event. So in the Titanic, the lady that wrote her diary or whatever. With the Gospels, these were the apostles, and they actually claim, when you read the New Testament, Peter says this, and they says we didn't invent this. We were eyewitnesses of His Majesty. We saw Him.
Right.
We put our hands in it. So they're claiming to be eyewitnesses. So you want eyewitnesses who were at the event. And then not only that, you also want early attestation. You want multiple attestation. So you want not only one guy saying it, but you want multiple people saying it.
Yeah.
So that's sort of an internal way of thinking about eyewitnesses.
You can have multiple people corroborating each other's stories. So this is why Christian theism should be given much more weight than, say, Mormonism, where you just have one guy, Joseph Smith, saying that these things happened, and then you might, with Joseph Smith, you might get other people that agree with him early, but they didn't experience it themselves, and so there's a distinction there that's important. So you want early testimony and multiple attestation, multiple folks corroborating the story.
Yes,
Ted, we've got to take a break here.
Okay.
When we come back, I think we'll get into manuscript evidence and other sorts of evidences, looking at the reliability of the Bible. But we've laid a good foundation here for how we should approach the text, and look at our assumptions, and from a historical standpoint, what are some of those important factors that we're looking for. And my microphone has just gone. We're back. My microphone went out. Sorry. So those are important factors that we need to consider when we're looking to the text. So we'll take this break now and stick with us, and we'll come back with some great, wonderful evidence for the reliability of the Bible.
You're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
Evangelical Christians are talking about hell. What if we believe what we believe because we've always believed it? What if the gospel is really a matter of life and death? We want you to open your mind, open your Bible, and rethink hell. At rethinkinghell.com, evangelicals look at what the Bible says about hell, putting conventional and controversial views to the test.
Let's say there's this Christian apologist. You love their message, but have trouble finding their videos, their articles, or social media posts. How do you stay connected to them? We're on it. Defenders Media uses the tools of the digital age to create content for your favorite apologists. We give them more screen time, more digital soapboxes, and more presence to deliver more of the content that you love. That's what we do.
I know that social media is important to those of you who follow my work. Many respond to my videos and posts on Facebook and Twitter, but it becomes impossible after a while to keep up with it all and to continue with research. That's why I'm thrilled that we have found a solution, Defenders Media.
Whether it's a website, whether it's printed material, whether it's a question on graphics, I cannot do what I do and reach my audience without the help of Defenders Media. They have been integral in helping me to reach my audience.
Defenders Media ensures consistent content reaches your hand from today's leading apologists and apologetic ministries, like Mike Lycona, Apologetics 315, the Veracity Hill podcast with Kurt Jaros, and more.
To learn more, text the word Defenders to 555-888, and we'll send you a free PDF of the top 5 ways to share the gospel online. Thanks for sticking with us through that short break from our sponsors. If you'd like to learn how you can become a sponsor or one of our patrons, go to our website, veracityhill.com, and click on that patron tab. We would love to gain your financial support, especially monthly ongoing support, so we can continue to go and grow our ministry. And a couple of those ways that we are going and growing, we've got a radio program now. So this, what was once just a little podcast out of one of my guest bedrooms back years ago, has now blossomed into a great radio ministry. And in 2019, we're looking to put all of our old episodes onto different platforms, specifically YouTube first. So we've begun to undertake that project and look forward to streaming on different platforms all at the same time. So that's part of our 2019 goal here at Veracity Hill, and we'd love your help to do that. Also, one of the ways we're going and growing, if you were listening during the break there, that Defenders Media commercial, you heard the voice of our guest, Ted Wright, and the ways we've helped him. So if you're interested in apologetics and want to have website or graphic design, we would love to get in touch with you and to be able to help you out. So we speak your language. That's one of the things that we help some of our prospective clients to understand. So, all right. Well, we're talking about the reliability of the Bible today, and we've got Ted Wright on the program. He's the founder of Epic Archaeology. You can visit his website, epicarchaeology.org. I've always had trouble with archaeology. They're actually 3 vowels back to back to back, AEO, archaeology. One thing I always had to work on. Ted, now you've been a guest on a program before. We do have some newer questions for Rapid Questions, though. So I think maybe we should give that a shot and get to learn a little bit more about you. So when you're ready, I will start the game clock.
Okay, go for it.
All right, I'll start off with a couple of them first, good old-fashioned classic questions. So they'll be easy. Taco Bell or KFC?
KFC.
Do you drink Dr. Pepper?
No.
Have you ever driven on the other side of the road?
Oh, yes, many times.
Okay. Have you seen anything weird lately?
Hard to say.
What is on the walls of the room you are in?
A picture, a map of Egypt that was made in 1844.
Okay. What type of music do you dislike the most?
Probably country music.
Would you go bungee jumping or skydiving?
Skydiving.
Who sent the last text message you received?
That would be you, Kurt.
Do you carry a donor card?
I do not.
Let's see. Where were you on Valentine's Day?
I was working.
Let's see. Oh, the time is up. I'll ask one more question here. Are you a morning person or a night owl?
Probably a night owl.
Okay. Very nice. Thank you for playing that round of rapid questions. Skydiving you would do, I would assume, because you've done skydiving before.
Well, actually, I've not skydived. I did do skydiving, but I was in the Air Force.
You're in the Air Force.
I did some stuff very similar to that.
Okay. So they didn't make you actually jump out of planes?
No, they did not make me.
Okay, good. Boy.
I did a static line jump once, though, but I don't know if that's considered skydiving.
And what's that?
That's where you jump out and the chute automatically deploys.
Okay.
It was out of a helicopter.
So you have jumped out of a helicopter?
Yes. Does that count?
And the helicopter was up in the air?
It was over the ocean.
Oh, my gosh. Oh. To me, I'm just like, I like my feet on the ground. I'm not even much of a water person. I like my feet on the ground.
Oh, it was fun, Kurt, because we actually this was down many years ago when there's an Air Force base near Miami, and where we landed in the water was a hammerhead shark breeding area. So, obviously, I survived.
Oh boy! Wow. All right. So fascinating stories. I'm not sure why people would do that. All right, getting back to the topic of today's program. And by the way, if you have questions, I'm keeping tabs on the live feed here. And we did have someone pre-submit a question. They saw you were our guest today and they had a question for you, which I think I'll be able to fit in when we get into archaeological discoveries. We're talking about the reliability of the Bible, and there are what's called manuscript evidence. So this deals with the question of, in terms of reliability, is what we have today what they wrote back then? And the manuscript evidence really helps us get extremely close to that time when we consider this was 2,000 years ago. Tell us about the manuscript evidence.
Right. So just to kind of review what we've talked about so far, Kurt, we've talked about there are, in understanding the past, and we're defending the premise, the idea that Jesus rose from the dead. That's the core truth of the Christian faith. And so where we learn about this primarily is the New Testament in the Gospels. And so the Gospels, in how we know the past in general, is through eyewitnesses. We had to have someone that was there, someone to see it happen. And then you have historical records, and then we have archaeological remains. So we're talking about the New Testament manuscripts. And let me just say this also as we sort of make the case here, that so for the reliability of the Bible, it's not any one thing. It's a whole host of things. I would say it's a constellation of things. It's like it's a cumulative case. So it's looking at all of the evidence all together. But since we're talking about manuscripts, we talked about early testimony, and we do want early testimony. The New Testament manuscripts has incredibly early testimony. So to give you an example, and this is often brought up, a lot of apologists will bring this up. I think I first read about it years ago when I read Josh McDowell's book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. But basically a comparison between the New Testament, say, and Homer. Homer's Iliad, we believe, was written around approximately 900 BC. The earliest copy that we have of Homer's Iliad would be 400 BC. And so it's approximately 500-year gap between when the event happened and the first copies that we have. Another one would be Caesar, Julius Caesar, in his book, The Gallic Wars, which we know from other historical sources were approximately about 100 to 44 BC. We know he was assassinated in 44 BC. The earliest copy that we have is 900 AD. So we're talking about 1,000 years in between when Caesar did this and the copies that we have. But nobody today doubts that Caesar lived or anything like that, or that Homer, of course, we know it was a myth, but and then you've got Plato and Aristotle, Tacitus, another great historian, which I'll mention here in a moment, a 900-year time gap. So just let's talk about the New Testament. The New Testament was written somewhere in between. Scholars are debated as to whether or not, the time frame, but I'm going to give a kind of a broad scale here. So somewhere between AD 50 and AD 100. So between 50 and 100 AD is the New Testament when it was written. Let me just say this too. We're pretty sure that Paul's letters, all his epistles, had to have been written before 70 AD. Well, why is that? Well, because in 70 AD, when the Romans came into Jerusalem, they completely annihilated the temple. And Paul, in all of Paul's letters, he makes no mention of the destruction of the temple. Surely that big of an event, he would have mentioned it in his letters. So he makes no mention of this. So it means that Paul's letters were written before pre-70 AD. So that's why the time gap there is around 50 to 100. But we got three manuscripts. We got portions of manuscripts of books of the Gospels that date to about 100 to 150 AD. We've got entire books that date to the same time. Historians call this the 2nd century AD. And then we've got, by 300 AD, we've got the entire New Testament in a manuscript. So currently, as it stands today, Kurt, with the manuscripts, the time span between when the event happened, the resurrection of approximately 33 AD, when that happened, and when the first copies that we have are 29 to 100 years after the event. That means that this is within the time frame of the eyewitnesses. So the New Testament is by and large way beyond any other historical document with the amount of manuscripts that we have, but then also the time frame between when the event happened and the first copies that we've got. So currently we've got about 5,800 Greek manuscripts, about 10,000 Latin manuscripts, about another 9,000, well over 9,000 Syriac and Coptic manuscripts. Coptic is Egyptian. And then we've got 36,000 patristic quotations. And I'm not sure if you had Dan Wallace on your program before. Have you had Dan on there?
We had him on after the week after the news about the Mark fragment came out.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, Dr. Wallace is the scholar to consult on this. And in one of his books, he said that. Well, actually, I think I have the quote right here. He said this. Well, I'll just quote what this is in his book on the New Testament textual criticism. He says, it would be safe to say that we have altogether about 20,000 handwritten manuscripts of the New Testament in various languages, including Greek. If someone were to destroy all those manuscripts, we would not be left without a witness, because the church fathers wrote commentaries on the New Testament. To date, more than 1 million quotations by the church fathers, the New Testament by the fathers, have been recorded. And he says, if all other sources for our knowledge of the New Testament were destroyed, the patristic quotations alone would be sufficient for the reconstruction of practically the entire New Testament. So it's just quite remarkable, the amount of manuscripts. And then he said, I actually heard him say this in person in a lecture he gave in Texas several years ago. He says, today we have ours is not a lack of evidence as Christians, but we have an embarrassment of riches in biblical manuscripts. So the New Testament is doing very, very well when it comes to manuscript evidence. So we've got early testimony and we've got multiple attestation. So it's a very, very strong accounting for the New Testament with manuscript evidence.
When we consider the events of classical antiquity, and you look at the manuscript evidence, comparatively speaking, the evidence we have is the best in history.
Yes.
Period.
And that's not an understatement. That is a fact.
That is the fact. In terms of the evidence, the manuscript evidence, it is the best in history. It's the earliest compared to the dates and the number of manuscripts. Simply the best compared to everything else we know.
That's exactly right. Yes.
All right. So tell us about archaeological evidence. This is your wheelhouse.
Yes. This is what I love, and it's one thing to talk about reliability. It's another thing to actually see it come out of the ground. And Kurt, one of the things that I've in the past many years that I've studied archaeology, one of the things that surprised me the most is that many archaeological discoveries that end up showing the historical reliability of the Bible were made by people not setting out to prove the Bible. They were made sort of accidentally. But there are many, many of them. Well, just for starters, just approximately every major New Testament city has been discovered or is known about archaeologically, historically. We know about these. So the biblical writers, the New Testament writers, authors were very familiar with what they were writing about. They're writing about actual events. And by the way, many of these cities were recorded first in the New Testament and then later discovered. So they were, people were skeptical whether or not they actually existed, and then people actually go and find them. One of the biggest examples was not the city, but the people called the Hittites, and it was believed that they were just an invention. And then in the about the turn of the 20th century, they actually found an entire Hittite library in a Hittite city called Ugarit.
Jackpot.
Jackpot. So absolutely.
I mean, if you're looking for evidence of the Hittites and you find a library,
in fact, you can get it if you wanted to get a doctorate. You could actually get your PhD in reading this language because it's still, by and large, left undeciphered.
Wow, that's pretty neat.
So the New Testament and the Old Testament again and again has proved to be reliable historically. So let's just talk about just the New Testament alone. We can talk about some pretty remarkable stuff. And that is, we've found so far, we have every major New Testament city, which I mentioned earlier, every Roman official that's mentioned in Paul's letters and also in the Gospels, we know about through archaeological evidence. One example, in 1961, archaeologists are digging in a place called Caesarea on the coast of Israel. It's called Caesarea Maritima. It's Caesar's city by the sea is what it was literally named. There's a Caesarea Philippi as well. But this city was gifted to Herod the Great by Octavian when he defeated Mark Antony in the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, basically gave Herod the city. So Herod then gave it back to Caesar and called it Caesarea Maritima. So Caesarea was the city, the seaport of the Roman Empire, and the seat of the Roman government in Judea in the first century. So we know from the New Testament that Paul went to Caesarea. He actually was on trial at Caesarea, and they've actually discovered, archaeologists have discovered the Praetorium, which is the government building, and very likely the hall that Paul stood in. I've actually stood on that spot. Well, in 1961, Italian archaeologists were excavating in the amphitheater at Caesarea, and they discovered an inscription containing the name of Pontius Pilate. They were not even looking for it, and they just said, oh, what is this? And they began to look at the Latin, and they had several people look at it, and they said, well, this is the Pilate that's mentioned in the New Testament. And then just recently, just in the past few months, I think last year actually, archaeologists digging and actually it was excavated years ago, but it was looked at in a warehouse. They actually found a signet ring, a Roman signet ring containing the name. It was his signet ring, the signet ring of Pontius Pilate, found in a place called Herodium, which is where Herod the Great was built. And to mention Herod the Great, I mean, we know a lot about Herod through archaeology. And I would say that if you really want to understand the cultural background, archaeological, historical background of the New Testament, then you have to look at Herod's impact in the New Testament, and not only just in the birth narratives, but also his shadow is sort of spread across the entire New Testament. We actually have a really good article on epic archaeology about Herod the Great. So if you go to epicarchaeology.org and click on blog, there's actually a really pretty extensive article on the reign of Herod the Great. So Herod is there. We have also one of the most remarkable artifacts discovered in connection with the trial of Jesus is the ossuary, or the coffin of Caiaphas. This is the high priest that presided over the trial of Jesus in the Gospels. When Jesus was brought on trial, they actually have discovered his ossuary. We'll say, Ted, well, how do you know it's the same Caiaphas as the New Testament? Well, from another source, from Josephus tells us that his name was Joseph ben Caiaphas. This is the high priest over Jerusalem in the first century. And on this ossuary that they discovered in Jerusalem, it actually is a very ornate limestone box, and it says Joseph ben Caiaphas. So there's no, in fact, skeptics don't even doubt that is the same Caiaphas. And the most amazing thing, Kurt, is that his bones were actually still in the box. They said that they contained the bones of a 60-year-old individual in his mid to late 60s. So this could very well be the bones of Caiaphas. So we have that, and there's just so many things. It's like we could spend like days talking about this. But yeah, every major New Testament city details, very, very explicit details that are mentioned in the book of Luke and also in the book of Acts, which are twin set. There was a study done years ago, and I've got it right here, and people have seen it. It's kind of hard to see there, but it's a book written by a Roman historian named Colin Hemer, and it's called The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History. And Hemer, what he did was basically he looked at the Roman, Greco-Roman references in the book of Luke and Acts and discovered 84 independently, historically confirmed, the locations of Roman cities, the seaports, everything is all there archaeologically. In fact, I've actually been, of course, Caesarea is where Paul left when he went to Rome. Of course, he was shipwrecked on Malta, and then ended up, when he landed in Italy, he landed, the book of Acts says, in, I believe it's Acts 29, if I'm not, can't remember the reference, but in the book of Acts, it says that Paul landed at a place called Pozzuoli in Italy, and you can actually go there today to Pozzuoli and see the place. There's a little church built where the Apostle Paul landed. So you can actually get your Bible in one hand and retrace the footsteps of Paul and find exactly everything there that the New Testament says. So all of this is archaeological evidence, is further confirmation that the New Testament writers were people that were there. They were eyewitnesses. They wrote it. They experienced it. They saw it all happen. And it's just a quite remarkable document.
For me, when I was asking these deep questions of the faith in my life, Luke played a huge part. The Gospel of Luke, the book of Acts, because he would make these historical reference markers. And I want to go through a few of them because this was so important to me.
Yes.
For example, Acts 18, verse 2. There he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla. Well, why did they come from Italy? Luke writes, because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. And this is a fact you can confirm. That's just, to me, that's just amazing. So that's sort of one of those throwaway things. But all these, like you said, Ted, these Roman officials and their titles, right? So not just the names, but their titles of when they were that position, in the same way that we might have a senator or representative, and sometimes people are representatives and then they become senators. In that same way, you can get that title attached to the name, and that helps with the dating. So for me, Luke, as this historian, back then when they were doing history, there was sometimes flexibility in how they reported it. And there's a spectrum. Sometimes people did a more rigid approach. Sometimes folks took a more fluid approach, and everything in between. With Luke, you do have these historical markers, these reference points throughout his works. And that was hugely important for me when I was assessing whether I thought the Bible was reliable. I came away reading Luke and Acts thinking, oh my gosh, this guy, he can't possibly just be making this stuff up. If you want to be making this stuff up, you make certain historical mistakes. You might not even mention these historical reference markers because you don't want people to, doubt it or double check what you're saying. And so Luke really cared for the veracity of the story of the gospel that was being told and preached and taught. So.
That's excellent. It's exactly right, and that's important. I mean, the names of these officials and their official titles are important because it basically, if the New Testament writers can get the details of that right, then they can also record accurate information about the core truth of the Christian faith, and that is that Jesus is risen from the dead. But not only do we have these archaeological and historical, the manuscript evidence, one of the other components of this is we have extra biblical eyewitness testimony as well. And I know we're about out of time, but let me mention one of them as we kind of wrap it up here. And that one is the Roman historian Tacitus. Tacitus is basically a contemporary of the New Testament writers. So we've got a guy that's writing at the same time the New Testament writers are recording. And I don't know if you've had Gary on the show, Gary Habermas, but Gary wrote a great book years ago. I don't know if it's still published. It's called The Verdict of History. And anyway, Gary writes about this, and I have an article on Tacitus as well. He's a very, very accurate historian, at least for the most part. And anyway, so from just Tacitus is writing from Rome, and he's recording about the Christians who lived in Rome in around the 60s AD time frame. And so there are about 15 independent things that you can discover just from Tacitus about what the early Christians believed. And I'll just mention them real quick here. Number one, that Christians were named after their founder, Christus, which is Latin. He was put to death by a Roman procurator, Pontius Pilate. Tacitus affirms this. there was this was during the reign of the Emperor Tiberius, and in between 14 and 37 A.D. His death ended the superstition for a short time. Well, you can imagine what that superstition was, that, of course, he was risen. And then he says it broke out again, especially in Judea, where the teaching had its origin. So the origins of the idea about the resurrection began in Judea. And then he says his followers carried this doctrine to Rome. There was a great fire, just destroyed a large part of the city during the reign of Nero. The emperor placed the blame on the Christians who lived in Rome. Christians were hated because of their abominations, as it was thought of. These Christians were arrested after pleading guilty. They were convicted of, listen to this, Kurt, hatred for mankind. Isn't that interesting? It sounds similar to what's going on today with the persecution of Christians around the world, and sadly, increasingly in America. But the early Christians in Rome were convicted of hatred for mankind. They were mocked. They were tortured. They were nailed to crosses and burnt to death, burned at the stake. And because of this, people had compassion on the Christians. Tacitus therefore concluded that such punishments were not good for public good, but were simply to glut one man's cruelty, and that one man would be Nero. So we have the contemporary writers that are basically saying the exact same thing that the New Testament is saying, which lends further credibility to the New Testament gospel reports.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I appreciate you bringing that home, the application of, man, if it is reliable, what does that mean?
Yes.
Ted, we have run out of time, but I do want to ask you one last question, and hopefully you can keep it simple here. This question comes from Brian, and basically he's asking, there was a classicist by the last name Ramsey.
Yes.
And so maybe you could tell us about him, but Brian's question is this. He's wondering, are Ramsey's books out of date, basically, because they are now written long ago, relatively speaking?
Yes. So this is William Ramsey, who is a classical historian back in the late 19th century, early 20th century. I think he's, probably 19th century. And I think probably early 20th century as well. And I've got several of his books. They are pretty good, actually, for a good foundation, but some of the details have become a little bit dated. So I would still read Ramsey. In fact, many early apologists still quote. I would quote Ramsey as well. The books are still sold, but I would check out also Colin Hemer, his book called The Book of Acts and the Setting of Hellenistic History. It's really, really good. And then also it's a commentary, and it's huge, and it's Craig Keener's commentary in the Book of Acts. Kurt, do you have that copy?
I'm not sure I do. I don't think it would fit on anywhere on my bookshelf because it is so big. That's the joke.
It's like 4 volumes that are like telephone books. You know?
But I think they're bigger than telephone books too.
I think you're right. I think they're like New York and Los Angeles combined. But Craig Keener really, I think, brings up to date a lot of the historical references to the Gospels, to the Book of Acts. But really kind of brings William Ramsey up to date on some of the historical and archaeological discoveries as they relate to the Apostle Paul and also to the New Testament.
Right.
But I think William Ramsey is great. William Ramsey.
Yeah.
It's good.
Yeah. Right. And that's a great question from Brian, because you have this classicist decades ago who wrote on what can be known from a historical archaeological perspective, and yet, even over the past 50 years, there have been new discoveries, and all of these discoveries have done nothing but confirm what is written in the text. None of these discoveries have ever gone against what the text has said, and that's fascinating. Now, there might be some a quandary, say, about Quirinius and the census taken, but there hasn't been an archaeological discovery that has disconfirmed what's stated. So there might be difficulties still that haven't yet the ground has not yet solved for us, but that doesn't mean that what has come out of the ground has disproven the text, and that's really important.
That's exactly right.
All right, Ted, thank you so much for joining us on our program today. Look forward to the future and what God has for Epic Archaeology and Defenders Media and all the great work you're doing. And I want to encourage our audience, if you don't yet support an apologetic ministry, consider supporting Ted's epicarchaeology.org. Ted's doing great work, and we need guys like him. Archaeology is so dry, literally, but how the content's presented can also be dry, and so Ted really makes it exciting for people. So thank you.
Thank you for having me on.
All right, on next week's program, we will culminate our series by talking about what it means to relate to God. Can I have a relationship with God? So looking at all these questions we've been dealing with over 6 weeks, what does that mean? And our guest on next week's program will be in studio, Lon Allison of Wheaton Bible Church. That does it for our program today. I am grateful for the continued support of our patrons and the partnerships that we have with our sponsors. They are Defenders Media, Consult Kevin, The Sky Floor, Rethinking Hell, the Illinois Family Institute, and Fox Restoration. I want to thank our technical producer, Chris, for his fine work week in, week out. And to our guest today, Ted Wright. Again, you can check him out at epicarchaeology.org. And last but not least, I want to thank you for listening in and for striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
You've been listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. This is a listener-supported program. For more resources, including past shows, visit veracityhill.com.